You probably have seen the ones at many small cafes like Toast Systems and Clover, where they kind of just come in and give you everything you need. An entire sort of point of sale system. Also, it even manages your inventory for you. And those solutions, they get to see a lot more data, which means they can do a better job of figuring out when fraud is occurring and also deliver just more value.
Hey everyone, I'm Pat Kinsel, joined by David Stearns, and this is the Payment Parallel. Third episode. In episodes 1 and 2, we've talked about the history of the payments industry and the innovation that it took to stamp out fraud and increase convenience for consumers and businesses alike. We've also talked about the need for a credential that can span a network of participants and how that credential can actually get enough data to stop fraud. And so today we're going to do a deep dive on the network and what the history of Visa and other payment systems has been and how they've gotten people to participate and how that might foreshadow what's going to happen in the identity market. And so, David, I'm thrilled to have you back with me again.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And maybe to get things started with a question. So in the book that you wrote, Electronic Value Exchange, you talk about how horrible it was back in the day when a transaction was authorized. Authorized really being the key word. And I don't think people appreciate how much happens today when they swipe their credit card. And so what traverses this network? Who's on this network? And how ultimately can they decide to trust a transaction?
Yeah, so how did the authorization happen today versus how it happened prior? Yeah. I think in the first episode, we talked about the manual, paper-based kind of methods for processing transactions that existed all the way up until the early 1970s. So the Bank of America card system was launched in 1958. And even in 1970, it was still operating in that same sort of way where they had floor limits. People would have to manually call for authorization for transactions that were above that floor limit. It became electronic in the early 1970s, 1973 for authorizations. And the pattern back then was partway automated, and then today it has been extended outward. In the 1973 system, what they were able to automate was from the point where the merchant authorization center received the phone call, they could have an automated response with the issuer's computer systems to get an authorization or approval or decline. And then in the 1980s is when they started to get the point of sale readers at the merchant locations so that you could swipe the card and get an authorization response end-to-end processed totally electronically. Today, it works still in kind of a similar way in the sense that when a merchant wants to authorize a card transaction, if it's an in-person kind of scenario, then it might be read by a point of sale terminal. If it's an online transaction, obviously the consumer is keying in their card details and then it's sent. But the transaction will flow through. Usually the merchant has some sort of processor like Stripe, who is their first point of contact for processing this transaction. The processor will be represented by a bank in the system, but often the bank itself is mostly taking the financial risk as opposed to providing the transaction processing details. The processor will talk to the Visa network if it's a Visa card, MasterCard if a MasterCard, etc. And so Visa acts as kind of the hub in the middle. And it says, I have received your request to authorize a particular card. And many people may know that the first few digits of your card number, they not only identify the card network, so you'll see card numbers issued by Visa starting with a 4, but then the next few digits identify the bank that issued the card. So the Visa switch, it's effectively a switch in the middle that says, given the card number, I know who to route this authorization to. Now, that switch can also provide some other functionality, and today, Visa does a lot of stuff while they're switching this transaction. They can do centralized fraud scoring, which we've mentioned before, that there's fraud scoring kind of happening at all levels of the system. But Visa adds their own as well because Visa sees every transaction that goes across a Visa network. They could also do things like detokenization of card numbers. And these days, when a card number gets used with a merchant, they often can swap out the card number for what's called a network token. It sort of limits the blast radius of a merchant having a data breach. so that if the card number gets breached, that particular card number the merchant is allowed to hold on to is actually specific to that merchant. It can't be used anywhere else. And Visa is the one that then does the detokenization back into the real card number at that switch level. Then it gets sent on from the Visa switch with all this extra information like the fraud scoring, et cetera, to the actual issuer bank. And in Visa, it's an open loop system, meaning that there are many issuers of cards, different banks that issued the cards. And Visa acts as the one in the middle that just connects all of these issuing banks with all of these acquiring processors and the merchants that they represent. Once the transaction gets to the issuing bank, then the issuing bank gets to decide based on their data and their estimation of fraud and your open to buy limits and et cetera, whether or not they're going to approve or decline the transaction. And that decision then gets communicated back through the network all the way to the merchant.
I think it's clear that this network is way more sophisticated than most people appreciate, right? And you've got data flowing through the system from banks to Visa to merchants. Everyone's collaborating. And so maybe for folks listening out there, like, what is modern day fraud scoring? What is it that someone like Visa is doing in the middle of this whole network and process?
Yeah, and fraud scoring occurs both, on the Visa Central Switch, like we talked about, but also at the acquiring side. Stripe ran their own fraud scoring, and issuers have their own fraud scoring that they do, and all these signals combine together because they all see different pieces of the transaction. Fraud scoring ultimately comes down to building up a machine learning model that can try to classify a transaction into how fraudulent does it appear to be. And that's usually based upon training it with data of past transactions where we know whether the transaction got contested or not, whether it got disputed or not, right? And if it got disputed for fraud purposes or if it was disputed for other purposes. Many people also kind of forget that there are many reasons why a transaction can be disputed in a card network. The common one we think of is, someone used my card to make a purchase that I didn't authorize. But other ones are things like merchants didn't provide the service, like you paid for something you never got, or the goods you received were counterfeit. So there's also fraud that happens on the merchant side, which is something that card networks have always had to deal with. There's people using using your credentials fraudulently, but there are also merchants who participate in fraud and try to sell fake goods or things like that. To answer the question around what is fraud scoring, we're training a machine learning model based on past transaction data where we know whether it was disputed for fraud or not, and trying to build up a pattern to recognize when a transaction looks legitimate or not. Oftentimes, this will be based on your past purchasing behavior with that card. So if Pat tends to use his card at the same kind of shops, at the same reasonable times of day, et cetera, then it's pretty obvious that this is a normal, a transaction that has gone through before and not been disputed, and so therefore it has a very low probability of fraud. But if Pat's card suddenly gets used in another part of the world to purchase something that is highly different than you've ever purchased before, and at a time of day when you would normally be asleep, many of the banks, I don't know if yours does this, but if you download their app and you give it permission to track your location, they use that as part of the signal and to say like, oh, your card is being used someplace that's miles and miles away from where your phone is. I kind of wonder if this is a little sketchy, right? So they're mostly looking for that kind of signal. And again, it's a continuum, 0 to 1 kind of probability, and the higher it is, issuers may choose to either throw some friction into the process and challenge you to say authenticate, and this is known as 3DS authentication in card networks, or they may just outright block it because they just think it's fraud.
Yeah, it's interesting. So some of the industries that I serve, they have this problem structurally. Like if you're a title company, someone only buys a house every 7, 11 years or, never, right? If you're an auto company, you only buy a car so often. If you are someone's retirement plan sponsor, someone works their whole life but may not come to access their funds and shows up one day and says, I want $150,000 for my retirement, right? And so they don't have the capacity or history or context to make those determinations, right? Is this person typically in these locations? Are these the behavior patterns that they typically use, right? And I think that really speaks to the power of being a part of a network and knowing that I'm relying on something that this person has used across all of these other, merchants or transactions, and when it walks through my door, I know that it is still in good standing. And I think, though, especially in today's age, the people listening, all the attorneys out there are saying privacy, right? And I completely agree. And I also think that, payments have solved this problem. So maybe if you could talk a little bit how, the credit card networks have been able to, stop fraud and maintain privacy at the same time.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right that the benefit of a general purpose payment card is that we see a tremendous number of transactions per card. So we have quite a lot of data to build up that history and to build up that profile of what normal use looks like and what fraudulent use looks like. The larger the amount of transactions that, say, an identity solution would see across a wider range, it just gives you a better chance of doing that same kind of thing. On the privacy angle, it's interesting. I mentioned that different players in the network see different parts of the transaction, and that's because once you hit the Visa switch, there's actually a fairly limited set of properties that go across the wire to the issuer. So, for example, what you're buying at a given merchant is not sent to the issuer unless it's a corporate card. And in some cases on personal cards, say with airline, when you're buying airline tickets, there will be the routes that you're flying that will be sent. But if you buy a book from a bookstore with a personal card, your issuer has no idea what book you bought. They only know that you bought something at this bookstore, right? So there is a sense in which privacy gets preserved to some degree. They can't monitor what it is you're buying, though they can see, obviously, where you're buying things. They know what merchants you're visiting and what locations, at what time of day, et cetera, and what the transaction amounts are. Corporate cards are a little different because of the way they're structured. The whole purpose is to facilitate expense reporting and things like that. So more transactional details can be sent along. These are known as level 2, level 3 kind of details. But these are things that not all merchants will provide to their processors, and not all processors will forward on to the issuers. So there's also a bit of lag in terms of implementation of these features.
Yeah, and then in terms of the fraud and the card revocation, I think that's also a really critical part of, it is a privacy, conscious solution, to solving the problem. And I'm curious if you can opine on that.
So if I do notice fraud on my account, which these days is much easier because, as we mentioned in the start of the bank issued cards, everything was manual. It might take you a month or more to even see a transaction that occurred. Today, I get notifications on my phone. As soon as an authorization occurs, you'll see a notification flow through to your phone. And if it's highly suspicious, issuing banks may even send you a text message and say, "Was this really you? Answer yes or no." And that's a bit of that kind of friction I was talking about earlier, where if it looks suspicious, one easy thing issuers can do is reach out to the phone number attached, the mobile number attached to the account, and send a text message that requires an answer. And if you don't answer, they assume it wasn't you and they will shut off that card. But if you answer yes, which is a fairly low thing to respond to as a legitimate user, then they go, okay, well, that was a legitimate charge. We won't turn things off. But that information flow, the speed at which I get notified now is obviously almost instantaneous compared to, say, like a month, as it was in the beginning. That allows me to dispute charges that I think were not legitimate or that, are resulting from a compromised credential. Once I dispute, the card may or may not get shut off. It kind of depends, obviously, on your situation, whether you're traveling at the moment. They may want to still allow transactions to go through, but you can give them parameters with which to block and not block transactions. And but if it is a situation where your card has been compromised, the issuer will just effectively shut it off and put it into limbo, and all new authorizations will just be declined immediately. Visa also maintains hot lists at the switch level, and so once a bank thinks that a credential is totally burned, they can let Visa's switch know, and Visa's switch can then immediately block transactions without even having to tell the issuer that they were occurring. They may let them know later through a notification, but in the moment, Visa could just block it initially.
Yeah, maybe if I could share a little bit about some of the real world examples we're seeing for some of this. And so, for many of the industries we serve, we've talked a lot about retirement, for example. the transactions that we process as someone who's requesting money out of their retirement account, the exact example that I gave earlier. And I think, what we talked about in some of our prior conversations, the benefit of instantaneous automation, right? Uniform data capture, right? Is what our customers are seeing. We're reducing errors, we're streamlining transaction speeds, better customer experience. And now what they're saying is, can you help us make the decision? Right? I've now digitized this process, but we had one customer say that they had 5 humans who looked at every, withdrawal request to assess fraud and trust in that transaction. So we helped them go from a paper-based process to a digital process, but there are still 5 humans that are looking at it. And this word is authorization, to me, is really the critical word to understand, and how the payment industry ultimately went to the point of saying, yes, give them the TV, and we stand behind this, right? Yes, send the person their retirement funds, and we stand behind this. And what I'm finding is then it starts a great conversation, which is, yes, that is what we want to provide for you and what we're working toward, but it's a give take, right? We need you to do things in order to help us solve that problem, right? And I think some of the parallels, again, in the history of Visa are really instructive, and are worth sharing with the audience.
Right. And what you just described is a really important aspect of the system that makes it really work. And that is when an issuer approves an authorization, there's a real sense in which the issuer is saying, I stand behind this. You merchant, you are guaranteed the money. If there is fraud, there are ways that merchants can shift that fraud liability back to the issuer, right? If fraud occurs, the usual transaction, the usual flow is to say that if the card number, say, was keyed in on a merchant site and it turns out that was a fraudulent transaction, the issuer will then normally do a chargeback or reversal to the merchant. But there are many ways in which merchants can effectively shield themselves from that by doing something that increases the security of that transaction, and that effectively shifts the liability back to the issuer. Okay, one of those things is called 3DS, or 3DS authentication, and it's a process that we don't see a lot in the United States, but is very common in other parts of the world when doing online transactions. And this is where you get challenged to authenticate with the issuing site, your issuing bank's website, during the course of the transaction. And if you're able to do that authentication, then the bank has a lot more incentive to believe this is really you and it's not fraud. Now, the merchant has to do something, though, to make this work. The merchant, this is not something that Visa or the issuer can just make happen for the merchant. The merchant does have to do some work to facilitate the 3DS flow. But if they do it, they get the liability shift. They're no longer going to be liable if it turns out that this was actually a fraudulent transaction, which is the likelihood of that will go way down because you're making somebody positively authenticate on the bank's website. Now, it could be that the fraudster also managed to maintain, obtain the credentials, the login credentials of the real cardholder. But at that point, the issuer says, you know what, we've done so much here that the issuer is now going to hold the liability for that transaction if it turns out to be fraudulent. This also helps on fee schedules too. So you can get lower fee, merchant can get a little bit lower fee if they've gone through that 3DS flow. The reason merchants don't always do it is that it's a trade-off of conversion, right? If you've ever experienced the 3DS flow, your first reaction is like, hey, what's going on here? Am I being, is this a phishing scam? What's going on? And so as a result, a lot of times people will back off and not complete the transaction because they don't trust it. So it looks a little fishy. If you've gone through 3DS several times, it becomes much more normal. And with 3DS version 2, they've introduced a frictionless flow, which uses device fingerprinting. And it makes it so that you generally only have to go through that challenge flow maybe once at the beginning on that device. And then every time you use that device in the future, they could just use the device fingerprint and you probably don't even see the pop-up.
Yeah, it's interesting, that evolution of in payments, the merchant, you do what you want to do versus, hey, you're going to conform with our policies if you want this liability shift, is exactly how I see where the identity industry is today. And I think every company is either a victim or benefactor of their history. But But for us, in the notary market, we always were having to solve compliance and workflow obligations for our customers at the use case level. So we would say, we'll do a real estate transaction for you in Texas and Florida, and an auto transaction and a wealth management transaction in Pennsylvania. And we have all of that compliance logic built into our platform. So you just send it, we know what to do. Where I think a lot of the identity companies are basically developer tools and SDKs. And they say to the customer, here it is, and you configure it how you want, right? And so for my company now to take this leap of saying, we're already basically, rep and warranting that we're going to do a proper auto transaction or real estate transaction for you. And now we're saying you need to follow our business process in order to take on risk or get to that automated authorization. I think it's not a bridge too far for us. And it's just interesting because other companies just don't seem willing to go there at all, right? And I think that's partly why the market's been stuck for a period of time.
Yeah, yeah. I would agree. If payments worked that same way, they would have never. They would have just the system would have never taken off, right? There wouldn't have been the critical mass to actually move things forward. It's interesting that in the payments industry, there's a lot of room for these independent software vendors to kind of come in and help merchants put together the techniques or the systems they need. So Stripe does some of this for merchants. And more so as the company has grown, there's a lot less of the need for a merchant to do a lot of custom software implementation, and they can instead use these kind of no-code solutions that are available. And many of the card present solution vendors also can come in with a complete system and just say, here you go, it all just works. You probably have seen the ones at many small cafes like Toast Systems and Clover and some of these other brands where they kind of just come in and give you everything you need. You get an entire sort of point of sale system for accepting card payments, but also it even manages your inventory for you, So it's a total solution for the merchant. And those solutions, they get to see a lot more data. They get to know a lot more about that business, which means they can do a better job of figuring out when fraud is occurring and also deliver just more value to those merchants.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the last point on the topic that I would make for folks is the concept of continuous authentication, and how in a functioning payment network, that's a passive thing that's occurring. And every single time you use your card and it doesn't get reported as being fraud by either you or the merchant, it's a form of continuous authentication. This credential is still trusted. You're using it multiple times a day. And then also this concept of stepping it up. You mentioned this earlier, introducing friction. And so, this is where we've rolled out a product we're calling Verify. And we now have a lot of folks in payment flows that are saying, I want to use this to step it up. And ultimately step it up and save it, right? Now that I've stepped it up and saved it, and I have this higher authentication and this persistent credential with constant passive authentication across a network of folks, you may, for some reason not trust someone at a certain moment in time. Maybe they're on a new device. But if you know that you're in a network where this person is transacting, you don't know what they're doing, but you know that they're still have a trusted credential in this network, and maybe someone prior to you stepped it up on that new device and established trust with that device, maybe that allows you to accept the transaction. You can have that higher conversion rate with lower friction. And so to me, this is where, we are trying to coin a phrase, identity authorization network, right? And really to drive that concept. If I could, screw it all, I'd say it's authorizations, right? And the way you get to authorizations is through identity in a network, right? But to me, that's really how we see the world, and the network is such a critical part of it.
Yeah, because there are, like you just mentioned, there are network effects that you get to benefit from. So classic example being, a device fingerprint. The first time I have to go through a 3DS challenge flow on a new device, it's kind of a annoying thing, but the more that happens in our lives, we kind of get used to it. But then the next merchant I go to on that same device doesn't have to pay any penalty, right? They just get the benefits of the device fingerprint that was established during the challenge flow in the previous version. And this is why networks sort of they can deliver more value the more participants join that network, and these is always known as network effects, right? And I think that exists in payment. It could exist in identity. It could exist in any kind of network in which You have a credential that you can reuse multiple times. And perhaps when you onboard and initially, there's a lot of friction, but then that friction can get amortized over subsequent uses. And what's great is that every participant gets to benefit from that amortization. It's not just the one, say, merchant who was the one that caused you to onboard in the first place. That merchant will benefit, but also another merchant who never, maybe you're now going to them for the first time. But now, if you have a general purpose credential, you've already gone through all that friction, and that new merchant gets to just benefit from that, and doesn't have to force you through that same set of hoops, that same thing that might cause you to abandon the transaction.
Yeah, for my startup geeks out there, there's a great HBR article. I'm going to forget the name, but it's about how to assess the strength of network effects. And it says that network effects that have both global and local ties are the strongest. And I think payments is one of the best examples, because you do have this local consumer benefit, right? But also that global network accrues data, value, all the things that we've talked about. And I think that's why, Visa, MasterCard have been such strong, durable businesses. Anyway, we can go on about networks forever. I hope people have found this really interesting. And for folks listening, I really recommend reading the book again, because I think if you're thinking about change, one of the hardest things to get people to do is agree, right? And to agree to participate in a network. And there's a lot of tremendous history about how Visa and D-Hawk got folks to actually sign up to be a part of it. And it wasn't easy. And so, getting the identity industry to all agree and do the same is also going to be a challenge, but the benefits are tremendous. And so I look forward to our last one. I think we got one more in us.
I think we do. And I'll echo the idea that it wasn't easy to get people to join in the particular network that became Visa. And it continued to be difficult to get them to agree to every step along the way, including even rolling out things like those point of sale terminals that immediately reduce chargeback fraud and reduce the amount of fraud in the system and increase the signal flow. And all of that stuff was all good, but boy, it was still a fight to get issuers to actually adopt the magstripe, adopt machine readable cards, get their merchants to adopt those point of sale readers. So these things are surprisingly difficult to get coordination on, not just in the beginning of the system, but all the way throughout.
Totally. All right, folks. Well, look forward to episode 4 and appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me.